Chicago, November 1888. John Wellborn Root climbed the scaffold stairs of a rising office tower on LaSalle Street, 11 stories into a gray lake wind, carrying a surveyor's level and a folder of drawings he no longer entirely trusted. The building groaned the way old ships groan, a low creak traveling down through brick and iron column. He set the level on a plank table near a window on the 10th floor. The bubble slid to one side. It slid further when the wind gusted, showing a full inch of drift in his own instrument, in his own building, under his own signature at the bottom of the drawings. Below him, on a drafting table 2 floors down, a bricklayer's foreman had already watched an inkwell tip over twice that week, the ink running toward the north wall every time a gust came off the lake. Root packed up the level without finishing the reading. He had climbed 11 flights to prove the frame was stiff enough. He left, having proven only that he did not yet know how to make it so. The wind kept blowing. The masonry kept absorbing it, at a cost measured in tons of unrentable brick that no architect's pen could make disappear. But this wasn't normal. By the late 1880s, architects in Chicago were building higher than anyone had built anywhere in wood, brick, or stone alone. A 10 or 15-story tower stacks up an enormous sail of masonry and glass, and a hard lake wind pushes on that sail with real, measurable force. Older buildings resisted the shove the crude way, with mass. Walls 3 or 4 feet thick at the base, tapering as they rose, so heavy that the structure simply refused to lean. That worked, but it was expensive in a way that mattered to men who counted floors as rent. Every foot of masonry wall was floor space nobody could lease. The new iron and steel skeleton frames promised something better. A thin, light structure of columns and beams doing the work masonry used to do. But the frame itself now had to resist the sideways push on its own. And that meant every joint between every beam and every column had to hold its shape under repeated load, not just carry weight straight down. A frame merely bolted together could stand up straight on a calm day. It could not stay stiff through a Chicago winter, and there were 5 specific reasons it stayed unsolved for 18 years. The profession itself did not trust thin metal to do a heavy wall's job. When William LeBaron Jenney proposed carrying the home insurance building's weight on an iron skeleton rather than load-bearing brick, the city of Chicago's building department halted construction in 1885 to check whether the frame would even stand under its own code. Architects and engineers had spent generations reading safety in tonnage. If a wall was thick enough, it was safe, full stop. A frame that weighed a fraction of a masonry wall and claimed to resist the same wind looked to most trained eyes like a bet no responsible builder should take. That instinct did not vanish once inspectors approved Jenney's building. It slowed the adoption of every lighter, stiffer connection that came after it, because each one asked engineers to trust arithmetic over the visible bulk they had been trained on for 20 years. The industry had a working, if wasteful, alternative, and working alternatives are hard to abandon. In 1891, John Root's own Monadnock building rose 16 stories on load-bearing brick walls that reached roughly 6 feet thick at street level, the tallest load-bearing masonry commercial structure ever raised in the United States. It worked. Tenants got a stable floor to stand on, and the city's building commissioner, however startled by the height, granted the permit. But every foot of that 6-foot wall at the base was rent the owners would never collect, space burned to hold up brick instead of desks and file cabinets. As long as thick masonry could still be pushed to its limit and still turn a profit, developers had no financial gun to their own heads, forcing them toward an unproven riveted skeleton. The metal itself was not yet reliable enough to rivet with any confidence. Early iron framing depended heavily on cast iron, a material strong under compression but brittle under the back-and-forth repeated stress that a rigid riveted joint would put on it. It cracked rather than bent. The 1879 collapse of the Tay Bridge in Scotland, where cast iron lugs failed under sustained wind loading, traveled through American engineering journals as a cautionary case, a demonstration of what happened when a metal frame met a lateral force it had never been designed to survive. Riveting itself is a punishing, repeated hammering process, and hammering brittle cast iron risks shattering it before the piece ever went into service. Only as wrought iron, and later mild steel, became commercially consistent could engineers trust a frame's joints to take the abuse a bridge already had to endure. Riveting simply cost more in labor than bolting, and for years that difference alone was enough to keep bolts on the specification sheet. A riveting gang needed a forge to heat the shank to a dull cherry red, a boy to catch and pass the hot metal, a man with a hammer to drive it, and a second man bracing a heavy iron bar against the far head to keep it from being punched straight through the plate. 4 workers producing one finished connection at a time, working from scaffolding at height, with an open coal fire burning near a half-built wooden and iron structure. A crew with wrenches could bolt the same joint with a fraction of the manpower and none of the fire risk. Contractors bidding tight margins on a 15-story job took the cheaper option whenever the building code and the engineer of record allowed it, and through most of the 1880s, both usually did. No one agreed on how to calculate the wind load in the first place. Structural theory for tall, slender metal frames barely existed in the 1880s. Some engineers argued a building's height could safely run 4 to 6 times its base width without special bracing, while others insisted the safe ratio was closer to 3 to 1. And there was no shared formula to settle the argument between them. Wind bracing got designed the way carpentry had always been designed, by rule of thumb, trade custom, and the nerve of the man signing the drawings, because the science of exactly how a tall frame swayed under a gusting lake wind had not yet been written down in any form an engineer could stamp with confidence. Without a reliable method to calculate how much rigidity a single joint needed to supply, no one had grounds to specify a riveted connection with any more certainty than a bolted one. By the spring of 1888, the Chicago firm of Wellborn Root held a contract for a building at the corner of LaSalle and Madison Streets, on a lot so narrow and so expensive, loop frontage was already running well over $1,000 a front foot in the busiest blocks, that the owners had told their architects plainly, no wasted footage on masonry bracing. 2 blocks away, John Root's monadnock was climbing skyward on exactly the kind of thick brick walls the new building's owners refused to pay for, and it was leasing fast. Wellborn Root needed a frame stiff enough to resist Chicago's lake winds using iron and steel alone, with no masonry crutch to fall back on if the engineering was wrong. There was no time left for another decade of trial and error. The building had to go up, lease immediately, and stand without complaint from a single tenant on the top floor. The figure below is presented as a composite, standing in for the largely unnamed structural draftsman and riveting foreman of Chicago's fabricating shops in the 1880s, a role no surviving record assigns to a single documented individual. Anton Kessler had come to Chicago from Stuttgart in 1874 at 19, with a trade certificate in metalworking and no English worth using in a courtroom. He found steady work not at one of the famous architectural firms, but at a small structural fabricating shop on the South Branch of the Chicago River, the kind of low brick works that smelled permanently of coal smoke and machine oil and never once appeared in a newspaper engraving of the skyline it was quietly building. Kessler drafted beam-to-column connection details all day and argued with the shop foreman most evenings, insisting rivet spacing be tightened past what the architect's drawings called for, a habit that had gotten him passed over for promotion twice already. He explained the joint to the shop's apprentices the same way every time. A hot rivet, he told them, is a rubber band that you shrink after you have already stretched it around the 2 boards you want held together. It doesn't just sit in the hole, it pulls. Most of the shop floor thought he was being difficult about half an inch of rivet spacing that nobody would ever see once the terracotta cladding went up. He thought everyone else had simply stopped noticing what actually held a building together. The first fix tried was the knee brace, a short diagonal strut of cast iron bolted between a column and the beam above it, meant to stiffen the corner the way a bracket stiffens a shelf. Architects used them throughout the early 1880s in Chicago office buildings because they were cheap to cast and simple to install. But cast iron knee braces resisted steady compression far better than the back-and-forth flex of real wind, and bolted connections at each end meant the whole strut could work loose after enough repeated gusts, leaving the stiffened corner no stiffer than it had started. Plaster cracked on upper floors within a year or 2 of occupancy in more than one building using this method, and building superintendents quietly added brace tightening to their regular maintenance rounds. The second fix was the diagonal sway rod, a thin iron tie rod bolted in an X pattern between columns, borrowed directly from railroad bridge trusses. Engineers on buildings through the mid-1880s specified them because the underlying theory was sound. A truss resists lateral load, and the parts were inexpensive, a few dollars a rod against the cost of thicker walls. In practice, the rods only worked in tension, pulling but never pushing, so half of any given wind gust left one diagonal rod slack, while the other took the full load alone, and the bolted end connections crept loose exactly as the knee braces had. Tenants on upper floors kept reporting a sway that engineers, on paper, insisted should not exist. Some firms simply retreated to thicker masonry rather than trust the metal frame at all. John Root's own Monadnock among them in 1891, spending on brick what a fully riveted steel skeleton would eventually deliver for a fraction of the lost square footage. It was not a failure of engineering so much as a failure of nerve dressed up as prudence, and it cost the building's owners rentable space for the entire working life of the structure, floors of income sacrificed to a method that worked but could never scale past 16 stories once the economics of thick masonry finally turned against it. Picture the object itself, a solid cylinder of soft steel, about 7/8 of an inch across and 3 or 4 inches long, with a rounded factory head already formed on one end. The kind of thing a riveter held in tongs and threw, underhand, dozens of times a day if he worked a gang. It cost roughly 1 to 2 cents to manufacture and was sold by the keg, a few dollars for 1,000 rivets that would go on to help hold up floors worth many thousands of dollars in annual rent. The trick was never the material, it was the heat. A rivet heated to a dull cherry red and driven into a punched hole while still soft would, as it cooled over the next several seconds, shrink back down in diameter. Not by much, a fraction of an inch, but enough to clamp the two steel plates together with several tons of force at that single joint, and to fill the hole completely, rather than merely touching it at a few threads the way a bolt did. Multiply that clamping force across the hundreds of joints in a building's frame, and the whole skeleton stopped behaving like a stack of separate parts screwed together and started behaving like one continuous, rigid structure, closer to a welded bridge truss than a piece of furniture. The counterintuitive part was that nothing new had to be invented to produce this effect. The physics of a shrinking hot rivet had been available to bridge engineers for decades before any architect thought to trust it at the height and scale of an office tower. What changed, starting with buildings like the Tacoma in 1889, was the decision to rely on that shrinkage entirely, with no masonry to fall back on, and to drive rivets fast enough at that height to make the method economical. A problem partly solved the following year, in 1890, when Charles Brady King's pneumatic riveting hammer let a single gunman finish in seconds what a hand hammer had taken minutes to do. A foreman on one of the early fully riveted jobs, watching an inspector's level stay flat through a gust that would have moved the needle on the building's 2 doors down, is said to have remarked only that the building finally stopped talking back. A line with no surviving citation, offered here as the kind of thing men in that trade said, rather than a documented quotation. By 1895, the riveted steel skeleton, tested first at the Tacoma and refined through Root's later work and Daniel Burnham's Reliance building, let architects push past 16 stories without burning floor space on masonry bracing. The American Surety Building in New York reached 303 feet and 20 stories that same year, a height record built openly on the Chicago method. The riveted connection went on to become the standard fastening method for American skyscrapers and long-span bridges for roughly the next 70 years, until high-strength bolts began displacing it commercially around 1960. For office tenants, the change was invisible and total. Insurance clerks, law firms, and newspaper staffs moved into buildings where the walls no longer had to be feet thick just to keep the structure standing, and floor plans, rents, and window light all followed from that single fact. For the riveting gangs themselves, heaters, catchers, gunmen, many of them immigrants like the fictionalized Kessler above, the work became a real and dangerous trade passed down for generations, most famously among Mohawk ironworkers who later drove the same joints on New York's tallest towers. No individual riveter's name sits on a plaque anywhere in the loop. The connection simply became the building and stayed there, unremarked, for as long as the building stood. That is the last quiet fact about the rivet. It never asked to be admired. It asked only to be heated, driven and left alone to cool and shrink, and pull two pieces of a skyline together so completely that no engineer ever had to think about that joint again, and no tenant standing at a window 100 feet up ever had reason to notice it was there at all.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget like and subscribe for more videos.